The story of the forbidden formula began in the quiet hills of New Jersey during the early 1930s. At the Picatinny Arsenal, the United States Army's Center for Ordnance Chemistry, rows of red brick laboratories stood among pine trees and snow fences. Inside, chemists in canvas coats and rubber gloves worked beneath hissing gas lamps, surrounded by the acrid scent of nitration vats. The compound that consumed their efforts was the same yellow crystal that had fueled every major war since 1914. Trinitrotoluene, known universally as TNT. TNT was stable, reliable, and safe to transport. It melted easily, poured neatly into bomb casings, and could survive the heat of the tropics without accidental ignition. Yet for all its virtues, it carried one crippling limitation. Its brisance, the shattering power that turned steel into fragments, was mediocre. Compared to the ideal of instantaneous, concentrated energy, TNT was sluggish, like a hammer blow cushioned by cloth. Artillery shells packed with it could kill men and tear up trenches, but against reinforced targets or armored warships, TNT often broke before it burst. By the middle 1930s, the world's military chemists had begun seeking something stronger. In Germany, the laboratories of Essen and Peenemünde experimented with RDX, short for Research Department Explosive, a crystalline compound discovered by British scientists during the First World War, but abandoned as too dangerous to handle. The Germans called it hexogen. When detonated, it released energy at nearly twice the velocity of TNT, an invisible storm front that tore steel apart at the molecular level. Across the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy's research arm at Kure was pursuing a similar path, mixing nitroguanidine and other high-energy compounds into experimental warheads. America lagged behind. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department, scarred by a series of deadly plant explosions during the 1920s, emphasized safety above all else. Explosive development had slowed to a crawl, and official doctrine declared TNT adequate for all foreseeable operations. Within the narrow corridors of Picatinny, however, a handful of chemists doubted that assurance. Among them was a young explosives engineer named Dr. Charles Peters, who in 1934 began experimenting with mixtures of TNT and the unstable RDX powder smuggled in small laboratory quantities from a British research partner. Peters discovered that when the two compounds were combined in the right ratio, roughly 60% RDX to 40% TNT, the result was astonishing. The TNT acted as a stabilizing melt for the RDX crystals, while the RDX multiplied the blast intensity severalfold. The mixture was given a simple designation, Composition B. Early tests astonished the staff. Bomb casings filled with Composition B split armor plates twice as thick as those shattered by pure TNT. The detonation velocity exceeded 27,000 feet per second. Yet every success carried peril. One morning in October 1935, a small test charge detonated spontaneously during storage, killing 2 workers and shattering windows across the compound. The subsequent inquiry by the Army Ordnance Safety Board concluded that the formula was unsuitable for field or plant use. Uncontrolled detonation risk exceeds field tolerance. By winter, official memoranda from the Chemical Warfare Service declared all RDX-TNT mixtures banned for production or experimentation without express authorization. The order was absolute. The files were sealed, and Composition B disappeared into the classified archives labeled Rejected Materials. While America turned away from the volatile substance, other nations pressed forward. At Woolwich Arsenal outside London, British chemists quietly continued refining RDX under the codename hexogen, developing safer manufacturing methods using wax coatings and solvent, purification. In Germany, I.G. Farben chemists mastered continuous flow nitration, producing RDX on an industrial scale. Their high-explosive bombs that fell upon Warsaw and Rotterdam contained precisely the compound the Americans had forbidden. For 6 years, the secret of Composition B lay dormant. The war that erupted in Europe in 1939 seemed far away from Picatinny's test ranges. But as Nazi conquests spread and the Luftwaffe's new generation of bombs devastated entire cities, whispers began circulating through Allied intelligence. The German explosives were far more powerful than TNT. Reports from the British Ministry of Supply confirmed it. The Luftwaffe's Sprengbomb cylindrish bombs carried hexogen cores, an RDX compound, stabilized with wax. The revelation ignited alarm within the American ordnance community. At Eglin Field, Florida, a munitions testing ground carved from pine forest and sand flats, an older chemist named Dr. George C. Hale read those reports with mounting fascination. Hale had begun his career at Picatinny before the ban and remembered Composition B well. His private notes from 1934 described its brilliance and its danger. In the humid spring of 1942, he reopened his old notebook and wrote a single line beneath the faded equations. What if we try again with control? Officially, Hale was tasked with improving bomb fuses for the Army Air Forces. Unofficially, he began experimenting in secrecy with small batches of the old forbidden mixture, aided by 2 enlisted technicians sworn to silence. They coated RDX crystals in paraffin wax and melted them gently into TNT at precisely 200 degrees Fahrenheit. To everyone's astonishment, the mixture cooled without the slightest instability. When tested in a reinforced pit behind the proving range, the explosion threw a 10-inch steel plate 100 feet into the air and left a crater twice the size expected for its weight. Hale documented every result meticulously. In a confidential memorandum later preserved in the Air Force Historical Research Agency, he wrote, "Properly stabilized with 10% wax. Composition B demonstrates detonation velocity of 27,000 feet per second, approximately double that of TNT. Fragment dispersion exceeds standard explosive by factor of 10. Safety at controlled temperature acceptable." What he had done was nothing short of heresy. He had revived a formula that the Army had forbidden 7 years earlier, an explosive declared too deadly even for war, and proven that with precision it could be mastered. Hale's colleagues warned him that discovery might end his career. But the reports from the Pacific and North Africa told their own story. German and Japanese bombs were inflicting disproportionate damage. The Allies needed an answer, and that answer lay in a beaker filled with pale yellow crystals once marked dangerous discard. As 1942 drew to a close, Hale prepared his final report for the Ordnance Department. He included the old prohibition order as an appendix and underlined its conclusion: "Uncontrolled detonation risk exceeds field tolerance." Beneath it, he added his own handwritten amendment in blue ink: "Controlled detonation, properly engineered, exceeds every known explosive." He ended the report with a single sentence that would echo through the laboratories and factories of wartime America: "If the enemy's advantage lies in chemistry, then we must unban chemistry itself." Within months, his findings would reach Washington. What began as a defiance of regulation would evolve into one of the most transformative industrial miracles of the Second World War. The banned mixture that had once been locked away at Picatinny would soon fill millions of American bombs, its energy multiplying the nation's striking power tenfold. For now, in the humid night air of Eglin Field, Hale stood, beside the smoking crater of his last test charge, watching sparks of molten steel fade into darkness. The forbidden compound had behaved perfectly. He removed his goggles, scribbled a note in his field book, and whispered the realization that would change the war. It works. 10 times the power of TNT and safe enough to make by the ton. The telegram arrived at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland on a cold February morning in 1942. Typed in block capitals across a single sheet of yellow paper, it bore a directive from the Office of Scientific Research and Development. Division 8. Commence immediate evaluation of Hale's stabilized RDX TNT compound under controlled detonation protocol. Priority 1. Codename Operation Brisance. Inside the red brick ordnance laboratories, where smoke and frost mingled above the proving fields, a handful of Army engineers read the message in silence. They knew the word brisance, a French term meaning the shattering power of an explosive. It was a fitting name for an experiment that many within the army considered reckless. The banned formula from the 1930s was back, this time under the sanction of wartime desperation. The first tests began within a week. Under heavy guard, technicians poured pale yellow blocks of Hale's Composition B into test casings identical to standard 500-pound general-purpose bombs. The explosives were manufactured at small pilot plants under the supervision of Colonel Harold M. Decker, chief of the Ordnance Department's experimental branch. Decker, a cautious man known for his meticulous notes, wrote in his diary that day, "We are playing with fire, but the enemy already burns our cities. If Hale's numbers are true, this mixture could change the war." The evaluation field stretched across frozen plains along the Chesapeake. Wooden towers marked off measured distances where high-speed cameras and pressure gauges waited, when the command was given. A single bomb detonated with a sound that witnesses described as a metallic thunderclap. The blast wave flattened every target within 200 yards. The shock instruments recorded pressures far beyond those generated by TNT. The detonation velocity measured over 27,000 feet per second, nearly twice that of the Army's standard explosive. But it was the aftermath that stunned the observers. Where TNT left large chunks of shell casing, Composition B reduced the heavy steel into thousands of high-velocity fragments. The fragments spread in all directions with lethal uniformity. Fragmentation radius exceeds 130 yards, Decker wrote in his report to Washington. Lethality increased several-fold, safety acceptable under wax stabilization. In the following weeks, further trials confirmed the results. The mixture burned cooler than TNT during storage, resisted moisture, and showed no tendency to self-detonate. Every test forced the Army's bureaucrats to confront an uncomfortable truth. The explosive they had banned 7 years earlier was the most effective compound ever placed inside a bomb. Resistance within the ordnance hierarchy was immediate. The Chemical Warfare Service warned of insufficient data on long-term stability. The Army's Safety Division cited the 1935 explosion at Picatinny as proof of danger. But the war in Europe was escalating, and reports from Britain described German bombs that tore through concrete with terrifying precision. The Luftwaffe's use of hexogen had become a matter of Allied intelligence record. The Americans could not afford to trail behind. In March, a special board assembled at Aberdeen to review the findings. Present were representatives from the Ordnance Department, the Chemical Warfare Service, the NDRC, and the Army Air Forces. Dr. Hale, flown in from Florida under armed escort, stood at the front of a small conference room stacked with documents, photographs, and film reels. He spoke softly, but with conviction. "Our soldiers will fight with what we give them," he said, pointing to a chart of comparative blast data. "The Germans have already doubled their explosive efficiency with RDX. We can match them and surpass them if we have the courage to lift the ban." The film projector rattled to life, showing slow-motion footage of 2 identical steel cylinders detonating, one with TNT, the other with Composition B. The first burst produced a bright flash and a mushroom of smoke. The second created a white flare and a shockwave so fast that the frame blurred. When the film ended, the room was silent. Colonel Decker broke it with a simple remark. "Gentlemen, if we do not use it, the enemy will use it against us." After hours of debate, the board voted to recommend limited adoption. The official memorandum dated July of 1943 authorized controlled production of Composition B for use in general-purpose bombs and naval depth charges. The decision carried the signatures of the Army's top ordnance officers. The ban of 1935 was effectively erased. Operation Brisance moved into its second phase, industrialization. The task was immense. Producing RDX required nitric acid, acetic anhydride, and precise temperature control, all in quantities far beyond laboratory scale. To accomplish it, the Army contracted Eastman Chemical Company, builders of the Holston Ordnance Works in Kingsport, Tennessee. There, Entire valleys were cleared and fenced with barbed wire. Workers erected acid towers, nitration houses, and vast earthen bunkers designed to vent explosions upward if disaster struck. Safety officers issued copper-free shoes and cotton overalls to thousands of employees, many of them women. They called themselves powder angels, their faces dusted yellow from handling RDX crystals. Each batch was mixed with molten TNT and 10% wax, then poured into molds under, the gaze of inspectors who understood that a single spark could erase the plant in an instant. Production data preserved in Army archives showed breathtaking growth. By December of 1943, Holston was turning out 25 tons of Composition B daily. By the following summer, output had quadrupled. Railcars rolled eastward to assembly plants in Illinois and Connecticut, where bombs were filled, sealed, and painted olive drab with the letters CB stenciled in black along the nose. In late autumn, the first shipment reached Eglin Field, the same proving ground where Hale had made his secret tests a year earlier. Technicians loaded the new munitions onto racks beneath B-25 Mitchell bombers for live trials over the Gulf of Mexico. When the bombs struck their targets, the water erupted in plumes twice the size of previous TNT tests. The Navy observers watching from patrol boats radioed a single coded phrase back to Washington. Effect verified. Brisance achieved. Within weeks, production orders multiplied. The banned explosive had become a cornerstone of American firepower. What began as a forbidden experiment was now an official war material, its chemical signature spreading through every theater of conflict. Late one night, as the first full-scale batch left Holston for overseas shipment, Dr. George C. Hale stood beside the rail line and watched the guarded train vanish into the darkness. The hum of its diesel engine faded into the hills. He understood the irony. The compound, once too dangerous to exist, would soon fill millions of bombs destined for the skies of Europe and the Pacific. In his final memorandum to the Ordnance Department that winter, Hale wrote a line that captured the essence of the moment. Science does not respect bans, it respects results. We have turned fear into force. Operation Brisance had succeeded. The world's chemistry of war had changed forever. The change from laboratory to factory was not gradual. It arrived like a storm. In the spring of 1943, when the Ordnance Department awarded the Holston contract to Eastman Chemical, an empty Tennessee Valley was chosen because it could be sealed, guarded, and if disaster struck, erased without destroying a city. Engineers from Washington arrived with blueprints the size of dining room tables, nitration houses, acid recovery towers, cooling troughs, and long, low buildings with reinforced earth berms between them. The plant would not be a single workshop, but an industrial organism designed to breathe dangerous chemicals and spit out stability. Building it required an engineering imagination that rivaled the Manhattan Project. Continuous flow nitration, a technique refined in Germany and Britain, became the heart of Holston's process. Where 19th-century explosives had been produced in small batches, laboriously and with constant risk, continuous flow systems allowed reactants to move through pipelines at controlled temperatures and residence times. Nitric acid and acetic anhydride were pumped through heat exchangers. The RDX precursors formed and quickly washed, then passed into solvent tanks where crystals precipitated under cold conditions. Recovery systems reclaimed spent nitric acid with an efficiency that stunned civilian chemists. What had once been waste now cycled back into the process. The economics of scale turned fear into profit. Safety was a religion. Every building sat behind blast walls that directed an explosion upward into sacrificial berms. Workers wore cotton uniforms without metal buttons and shoes made from non-conductive materials to reduce static. Copper tools were forbidden in many areas. The plant's walkways were grounded. Lightning arresters and humidity controls kept the air just wet enough to prevent dust from igniting. Entrances were guarded, passes checked twice, and every employee signed a document acknowledging that a single mistake could undo the town. In the words of one foreman's memorandum preserved in the National Archives, We are building with the constant thought that these are not merely factories but pressure chambers for safe destruction. Holston hired thousands. With so many men overseas, women performed much of the dangerous work. They loaded nitration baths, inspected crystals under microscopes, packaged finished RDX into wax-lined cases. The local newspapers called them powder angels, a name that carried both pride and the faint odor of fear. Oral histories recorded decades later recalled the secrecy. Children at the plant gate asked what their mothers did, and the mothers answered with a smile and a hand over the child's mouth. Yet, week after week, those same hands handled molten explosives at high temperatures, ladling melted TNT into molds, and folding in RDX that had been coated with paraffin to render it less sensitive. Production figures, when released in declassified reports after the war, read like an industrial miracle. Holston moved from pilot production to full output in a matter of months. By December of 1943, the plant produced approximately 25 tons daily. By the end of 1944, linked sister plants in Illinois and Connecticut increased national RDX output to levels once thought impossible. What had been a laboratory curiosity became a commodity shipped by rail to assembly depots across the continent. Rail cars, labeled with military seals, rolled through guarded yards at night. Bomb-filling plants in Kankakee and Bridgeport received the RDX and mixed it with TNT, pouring the hot slurry into 1,000-pound casings that would later ride under bombers bound for Europe and the Pacific. The logistical choreography was precise. Acid shipments came by tanker, raw precursors by boxcar, and molten charges moved in heat-insulated containers to fill lines that operated around the clock. Quality control teams sampled each batch, testing melt points and brisance in small contained pits. Metallurgists watched the fragmentation patterns from test rounds and adjusted casting techniques to avoid the creation of large, lethal splinters that could ricochet dangerously in friendly zones. Even the paint used on completed bombs was specified to avoid solvents that might interact with residue. Every stage of the chain had been rethought with a single wartime imperative: reliability under mass production. Not all days were routine. There were accidents, small detonations that shattered windows, chemical leaks that required evacuation, a storage shed consumed in flame, and each time the plant rebuilt and tightened procedures. The lessons of 1935 at Picatinny had not been forgotten. They had been institutionalized. Engineers installed safety tunnels, long open trenches that directed force upward should a reaction run away. Pressure relief ducts vented explosions into sacrificial chambers that could collapse without killing workers. Those designs saved lives. As the first freight cars left Holston, loaded with drums stamped RDX, Composition B, the nation's industrial scale became visible in a new way. The banned formula had been transformed by engineering into a product that could be manufactured by the thousand, shipped by the thousand, and trusted in the hands of airmen who would never enter the plants. In factory mess halls, women who had once reminded one another to mind the spark now served coffee to railroad crews and laughed at stories of long night shifts. Their work had made a new kind of ordnance possible. By late 1944, the industrial revolution around explosives had become as decisive as any battle. Holston and its sister plants were not merely factories, they were laboratories of scale where chemistry met logistics, where danger was reduced to process and then multiplied into power. The forbidden compound was no longer a moral or technical anomaly. It was a manufactured certainty on rails heading to war. On the morning of April 18th, 1943, the sky above the Solomon Islands was a thin, bright sheet of blue. In the hangars at Guadalcanal, mechanics tightened bolts and primed engines. Over the coral atolls and jungle airstrips, the word had arrived that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto would be traveling that day in his inspection flight. The intelligence came from a decrypted Japanese message, an achievement of code breakers ashore, and it carried a terrible clarity. The architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor would be airborne at a predictable hour on a predictable route. What followed was one of the most daring interceptions of the war. an operation whose audacity would be measured not by tonnage or ground covered but by endurance and timing. The mission staff at 13 Fighter Command drew a single line on a map and called it Operation Vengeance. The route stretched from Guadalcanal to Bougainville and back, a round trip of over 400 miles across open ocean, far farther than any fighter was supposed to fly at the time without tanker support. The weapon for that long reach was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a twin-engine interceptor with the range, speed, and armament to make such a gamble possible. 18 P-38 seconds launched in 2 flights, each fitted with additional fuel tanks under the wings. The pilots were a mix of young men and hardened flyers. Lieutenant Colonel John W. Mitchell led the mission, First Lieutenant Thomas G. Lanphier, Second Lieutenant Rex T. Barber, and others formed the vanguard that would close with Yamamoto's formation. They climbed out of the humid morning, their twin Allison engines whining as the island receded. For hours, the P-38 seconds threaded their way above featureless ocean, navigating by dead reckoning and celestial fixes, timing their arrival to intercept a flight of Japanese G-4M1 Betty bombers, escorted by fighters. When the contact was made near Kahili, airfield on Bougainville, the formation below shimmered through heat, haze, transport planes and fighter cover, moving at medium altitude on a coastal leg. The P-38 seconds dove in, engines screaming, their nose-mounted armament, 2 20mm cannons, and 4 Browning machine guns, concentrated in the fuselage to deliver an annihilating burst without convergence error. The action lasted minutes that stretched into lifetimes. Eyewitness accounts from American pilots and captured Japanese logs later described a sudden, violent burst of fire and smoke. One Betty fell in flames, then another, their wreckage smouldering in the jungle. The mission's result was false in its simplicity. From the first debriefings through post-war research, credit for Yamamoto's loss remained contested. Official U.S. Army Air Force's paperwork recorded that Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's flight had successfully intercepted and shot down the lead bomber carrying the admiral. Other accounts, notably from Lieutenant Barber, claimed that his aircraft delivered the decisive attack on Yamamoto's plane. First Lieutenant Lanphier later wrote reports asserting his role in the engagement as well. The National Archives contain the operation files, the Hornet of pilots' statements, and the terse naval records from the Japanese 4th Air Group, all of them consistent about one fact: the Admiral's aircraft crashed, and with it died a symbol of Japanese naval strategy. Who fired the fatal burst mattered to histories and medals, to the men on the ground and the sailors in the Pacific. The result was a strategic and psychological blow. What the operation also revealed was not just pilot skill, but the growing integration of intelligence, logistics, and chemical power. The P-38's concentrated nose battery of cannon and machine guns was emblematic of an American approach to ordnance. Bring the destructive capacity forward in a form that could be aimed precisely and delivered reliably. The Lightning's armament cannons that fired armor-piercing shells and rounds whose composition and velocity had been honed through years of munitions research turned a fleeting sighting into annihilation. Pilots later described the recoil, the flash, the taste of powder in the mouth when they opened up on a bomber, instruments of chemistry and metallurgy forged by factories back home. Japanese records and post-war interrogations captured the human detail. Ground crews who saw the falling wreckage spoke of white flashes and a concussion that threw men to the earth. In the 4th Air Group's war diary, the entry for April 18th is a short, stunned notation. Formation attacked. Plane exploded. Admiralty staff lost. Survivors in the escorting fighters described how quickly cohesion evaporated once the lead was struck. The military consequence was immediate. The Japanese Navy lost not only a strategist, but also a morale anchor. Allied commanders, conversely, recognized that a single, well-executed interception could produce effects out of proportion to its size. Operation Vengeance also carried lessons about the evolving technology of destruction. It demonstrated that precision and range could substitute for mass, that a small number of aircraft, properly armed and guided by intelligence, could alter the strategic picture. In the months that followed, American aviators and ordnance officers would study the engagement for its tactical genius, while ordnance boards would note another truth: accuracy amplified by concentrated explosive power multiplied lethality. The Lightning's guns were small compared to a bomb, but their ammunition, metallurgy, propellant, fuse design was the same industrial story as the new explosives pouring from plants like Holston and Bridgeport. Chemistry and logistics underwrote the hit. Decades later, veterans would gather in reunion halls and argue over who fired the fatal burst. Historians would weigh camera films and radio logs. But on that April morning, in the sudden shimmer of smoke over jungle and coral, men on both sides felt a different kind of awe. The age of long-range interception had arrived. The age of industrial chemistry that could concentrate terrible force into a moment had arrived with it. Operation Vengeance had ended a life and marked the turning point in a war whose scales were measured as much in intellect and factory output as in courage and shells. By late 1943, America's war machine was no longer learning to fight, it was learning to manufacture destruction with mathematical precision. The new explosive, Composition B, had moved from test ranges and classified memos into mass production. Its presence began to shape every weapon that crossed the Atlantic or Pacific. 500-pound bombs, 1,000-pound bombs, naval shells, torpedoes, and depth charges. In each case, the forbidden chemistry of the 1930s had become the beating heart of the Allied arsenal. At the Naval Ordnance Test Station in California, engineers rewrote the manuals for bomb composition. The Bureau of Ordnance formally approved Composition B for use in general-purpose aerial munitions, depth charges, and armor-piercing ordnance. A single memorandum from October of 1943 recorded, with bureaucratic calm, what it truly meant: detonation velocity approximately double that of TNT. Brisance factor exceeds standard by an order of magnitude. Composition B suitable for all climates and storage. Behind that sentence lay a revolution in how war was waged. The same number of aircraft could now deliver twice the destructive yield. The same naval shell that once punched a hole through steel could now tear it apart. Bombing formations that had once needed entire squadrons to destroy a bridge could accomplish the same with half the aircraft and fewer losses. The chemistry of the battlefield was tilting toward exponential advantage. In England, at airfields scattered across Norfolk and Lincolnshire, the 8th Air Force prepared for deep penetration raids into the German heartland. Maintenance crews loading bombs beneath B-17 flying fortresses noticed subtle changes in the markings. New serials beginning with CB, a faint smell of wax and acid. They were told little. To them, it was just new powder. But the results spoke through the ground tremors of detonation. Over Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and later the Ploiești oil fields, the blast signatures grew sharper, the impact craters deeper. Reconnaissance photos showed bridges obliterated, rail yards erased, entire factories flattened in patterns that no TNT could have produced. Japanese forces would encounter the same chemistry months later. When carrier groups struck Rabaul, the bombs that tore through concrete shelters and anti-aircraft emplacements contained the same forbidden formula rediscovered by Hale. Captured diaries of Imperial engineers later noted the difference. A Japanese ordnance officer wrote, "The Americans employ a new explosive of terrifying power. Shell fragments are smaller but far more numerous. Our bunkers cannot resist." Back in Tennessee, the workers at Holston hardly knew the extent of their contribution. They saw only the endless schedules, the rail cars filled with pale yellow blocks, the smell of acid in the air, and the sirens that occasionally wailed when a valve overheated. Yet every ton they produced shifted the arithmetic of the war. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, completed after victory, would later calculate that the adoption of Composition B increased the effective destructive yield of American aerial ordnance by nearly threefold without any change in aircraft numbers. The scientific community understood what had happened. Chemistry had become strategy. The reaction rates and detonation pressures in a test crucible at Picatinny or Eglin now determined whether a bomber wing lived or died, over Europe. The fusion of scientific daring and industrial discipline, two elements that rarely coexist, had created something the Axis powers could no longer match. Dr. George C. Hale, now promoted to a senior consultant within the Ordnance Department, wrote his first post-war article for the Journal of Applied Chemistry. In it, he avoided military jargon. He spoke, instead of energy, containment, and the balance between stability and violence. Explosives, he wrote, are not inventions. They are recognitions of nature's potential arranged by human will. His readers, many of them veterans returning to civilian laboratories, understood the quiet meaning behind those words. The mixture once banned for danger had become a symbol of controlled ferocity, the science of restraint harnessed to victory. But the chemistry of victory left a shadow as deep as its light. By 1945, American factories were producing more high explosives in a single month than Germany had managed in an entire year. The efficiency of killing had become a measurable metric, expressed in tons per sortie, gallons per target, dollars per square mile, destroyed. In the Pacific, as the B-29s prepared for their incendiary campaigns over Japan, the lessons of Composition B had already carried forward. Chemists who once stabilized RDX now refined even more powerful compounds HMX, tetryl, and the first precursors to the post-war plastic explosives that would dominate future conflicts. In a letter preserved in the archives of the National World War II Museum, Hale reflected on the paradox. We sought a more efficient explosion and found instead a new scale of destruction. It began as chemistry and ended as history. The transformation was irreversible. The banned explosive of the 1930s had not only made American bombs 10 times deadlier, it had redefined the relationship between science and war. From the smokeless glow of Picatinny's first experiments to the thunder of Holston's production lines, every formula written in secrecy became a line in the story of industrial warfare's maturity. By the war's end, when American and British scientists met in Washington to compile their joint ordnance report, one entry stood apart among tables of armor, penetration, and yield ratios. Composition B, stabilized RDX TNT, approved for all services. Contribution to victory decisive. The chemist's secret, once hidden behind laboratory doors, had become the chemistry of victory, and the world it created would never again look at explosives, or at science itself, as merely tools of war. They had become instruments of total power, measured not only in tons, but in understanding. By the time 1944 arrived, the chemistry born in secret laboratories had moved into every theatre of war. The banned mixture, RDX, stabilized in a melt of TNT, was no longer merely a laboratory curiosity. It had become the seed of new explosives, whose names would be whispered in dockyards and on carrier decks. Among the most consequential of these was a British development called Torpex, an alloy of RDX, TNT, and powdered aluminum that multiplied underwater blast effects and changed naval warfare's arithmetic. Torpex did not spring fully formed from a single mind. It was the product of transatlantic collaboration. British ordnance chemists at Woolwich refined the proportions. Naval engineers in Scotland tested charges against concrete emplacements, and Allied procurement channels arranged the flow of raw chemicals. The formula typically combined RDX and TNT in roughly similar parts, with an addition of aluminum powder that increased the explosive's gas production and thermal output. The result was approximately 1.5 times the energy of an equivalent weight of TNT when used against submerged targets. That extra energy altered how shock waves propagated through water, converting a torpedo strike from a pierced hull into catastrophic structural collapse. The naval consequences were immediate and dramatic. Torpedoes and depth charges filled with the new mixture could rupture submarine pressure hulls at ranges that TNT could not reach. Harbour defences, once considered invulnerable to aerial bombing, became vulnerable to precisely delivered underwater detonations. The Royal Navy's attacks on the German battleship Tirpitz and on U-boat pens along the French coast demonstrated how concentrated chemical energy could supplement accuracy and navigational daring. Where the old explosives punched holes, Torpex shattered whole volumes into useless fragments. Across the Atlantic, American engineers watched and adapted. The Holston chemists who had learned to scale RDX production for Composition B found themselves in sustained technical exchange with ordnance labs on both sides of the ocean. Expertise in continuous flow nitration, solvent washing, and paraffin phlegmatization transferred directly to the manufacture of more complex mixtures. The chemistry that had once been proscribed because of its danger now underwrote the Allied edge in sea, air, and undersea warfare. Perhaps more unexpectedly, the industrial alchemy of high explosives intersected with the atom's own violent logic. In the secret community of Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford, scientists who had cut their teeth on RDX and Composition B became indispensable to the Manhattan Project's engineering problems. Explosive lenses, the shaped charges that compressed plutonium cores into supercritical mass, required precisely timed detonation fronts. That precision demanded two families of explosives, a fast, high-brisance compound and a slow, low-brisance filler, whose relative velocities could be arranged to form converging shock waves. British and American ordnance teams drew on baratol, a slow mixture of barium nitrate and TNT, alongside RDX-based fast charges to build lenses whose timing tolerances measured in millionths of a second. The connection was not merely theoretical. Skilled technicians from ordnance factories traveled to testing ranges to advise on casting techniques, bonding materials, and timing circuits. Metallurgists who had studied fragmentation patterns for aerial bombs applied the same analytic rigor to the geometry of explosive lenses. Men and women who had ladled molten Composition B into aerial casings found themselves instructing physicists on how to cast hemispheres of high explosive with uniform density and reliable detonation velocity. In short, the wartime ordnance industry learned to manufacture certainty out of volatile ingredients. The lineage from Composition B to Torpex to explosive lenses illustrates a larger truth about modern war. Chemistry and industry are indistinguishable once mass production begins. A single formula refined in a laboratory becomes folded into a supply chain, then into factories, and finally into tactics. Torpedoes that once relied on mass and proximity now relied on chemistry. Bombs that once sought to crush a building's walls now sought to shatter its skeleton. The same knowledge that sank ships filled bomb bays and shaped the devices that ended the war in the Pacific. Naval archives later credited Torpex-laden charges with decisive blows against hardened targets. The Naval Historical Command summarized the effect in a post-war analysis: increased underwater destructive radius, greater hull rupture probability, and a dramatically higher chance of catastrophic secondary failures. In terrestrial bombing, the addition of aluminum fines to an RDXT-NT matrix increased the mass of hot gas and molten detritus, making incendiary cascades more likely and ensuring that reinforced concrete would disintegrate rather than merely crack. The industrial challenges, however, remained daunting. Aluminum powders had to be fine enough to burn homogeneously, but coarse enough to avoid spontaneous ignition during storage. Nitration temperatures had to be held within narrow bands. A few degrees deviation could produce crystals with dangerously different sensitivities. In Holston and the sister plants, engineers installed redundant heat exchangers, humidity controls, and automated shutoffs. Safety tunnels and berms were built to channel an accidental blast upward and away from workers. The cost of scale was vigilance. By 1945, the fruits of industrial alchemy were visible on multiple fronts. Torpex-filled torpedoes punctured submarine pens, Composition B-charged bombs erased concrete installations, explosive lenses enabled an end to the atomic stalemate. The same chemistry that had been banned for its potential to kill accidentally was now harnessed and directed with fearful precision. In a memorandum preserved after the war, a Los Alamos engineer wrote, We used the language of chemistry to tune force itself, shaping how energy unfolds in space and time. That sentence captured the paradox of the era. The forbidden had been transformed into an instrument of control. The alchemy was not mystical, it was industrial, the translation of laboratory insight into factories, and factories into strategy. When historians later mapped the genealogy of 20th century ordnance, they drew a line from a small test pit at Picatinny to the drowned hulks of battleships and to the implosion chambers of the desert. The banned formula had been neither merely weapon nor mere curiosity. It had become the raw arithmetic of victory. Molecules arranged in industrial volumes to produce effects that history would measure in ships sunk, shelters destroyed, and, finally, in the sudden, planet-altering geometry of the atom itself. When the summer of 1945 dawned over the New Mexico desert, the story that had begun a decade earlier in a quiet corner of Picatinny Arsenal reached its final transformation. The sunrise that broke over the Jornada del Muerto Basin on July 16th carried within it the chemistry of every explosive mankind had ever conceived, and then something beyond chemistry entirely. The device assembled at the Trinity test site was no mere bomb. It was the ultimate evolution of the same scientific line that had produced Composition B, RD-X, and Torpex, the marriage of precise detonation and industrial discipline. In the weeks preceding the test, teams at Los Alamos worked in silence, broken only by the ticking of clocks and the hissing of vacuum pumps. Around them lay blocks of the same high-explosive compounds first deemed too dangerous for wartime use. These were not powder kegs. They were lenses, hemispheres of carefully cast explosive, designed to compress the plutonium core with mathematical exactness. The outer layer, composed of Composition B and fast-burning RDX-based materials, was matched to inner layers of baratol and TNT that burned just slowly enough to bend a detonation wave inward. The timing had to be perfect to the microsecond. If one detonator failed, the weapon would simply blow apart harmlessly. If all succeeded, the world would change forever. At dawn, when the tower-mounted device known as Gadget exploded, the blast turned sand to glass and theory to reality. Observers miles away felt the ground roll as if the earth itself were exhaling. Many of them chemists, engineers, and ordnance officers had spent the war perfecting high explosives for conventional bombs. They knew what 10 tons of Composition B could do. What they saw that morning dwarfed every explosion in human experience. "Now we are all sons of chemistry," one observer said wryly, before quoting scripture about the destroyer of worlds. The line from Composition B to atomic fire was not philosophical, it was literal. Without the RDX casting techniques developed in Tennessee, without the detonation studies of high-velocity shock waves, the implosion method might never have succeeded. As one post-war report from the Air Force Historical Research Agency noted, the precision control of detonation velocities developed for Composition B manufacture formed the practical foundation for implosion weapon design. The very same formula banned in 1935 had given mankind the tool to unleash energies measured in thousands of tons of TNT equivalent. While scientists recorded seismic readings and collected radioactive dust, across the Pacific, the conventional heirs of that chemistry were also at work. Fleets of B-29 bombers departed the Marianas daily, carrying bombs filled not with uranium or plutonium, but with the same Composition B that had already reshaped warfare. Those bombs struck Japan's industrial belt with merciless regularity, flattening entire square miles of Osaka, Nagoya, and Yokohama. The blast effects were consistent. Shattering waves, followed by vacuum pressure that tore apart what the first wave had broken. Reports from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that the brisance of modern American ordnance exceeded all expectations, a phrase that served as both tribute and warning. Within weeks, the war ended not through attrition alone, but through the convergence of industrial chemistry and atomic physics. Yet, in the laboratories and factories that had built the war's arsenal, there was little celebration. Engineers at Holston disassembled their continuous flow lines, storing the nitration vessels that had once fed the front. Dr. George C. Hale, whose curiosity had revived the banned formula, walked through the quieted rooms at Eglin Field and later wrote that the silence felt heavier than the noise. For a man who had devoted his life to controlled explosions, the end of noise was not peace, but aftermath. Post-war evaluations transformed that aftermath into doctrine. The U.S. Army Ordnance Board, reviewing wartime explosive performance, issued a terse summary: RDX and HMX-based compositions constitute the future of military energetics. The recommendation paved the way for the next generation of munitions, from rocket propellants to shaped charges and nuclear triggers. The forbidden mixture had become standard, then indispensable, and finally foundational to a new era where destructive capacity was measured not in pounds or tons, but in yield and efficiency. Meanwhile, in the ruins of Germany and Japan, captured scientists studied fragments of American ordnance and marveled at their complexity. Former Luftwaffe technicians reported disbelief that such materials could be mass-produced. One interrogation report recorded a Japanese naval chemist admitting, "We considered RDX impossible to make safely in industrial quantities. The Americans made rivers of it." Yet the shadow of that success lingered. The war had proven that the logic of chemistry, once applied to destruction, could not easily be recalled. The post-war years saw the creation of peacetime explosives, industries of synthetic fuels, plastics, and fertilizers derived from wartime research. The same continuous nitration processes that once filled bomb casings now produced consumer goods and industrial chemicals. Civilian prosperity was built upon the same molecular scaffolding as total war. At the 1962 U.S. Japanese Aviation History Symposium, held in Tokyo, a surviving ordnance officer from the Imperial Navy listened as Dr. Hale presented a paper titled Energetics and the Modern Industrial State. Hale's talk avoided politics, but its subtext was unmistakable. He described how the pursuit of stability in unstable compounds mirrored the struggle for peace after violent invention. When he concluded, the Japanese officer rose and said through an interpreter, "You turned chemistry into destiny." Hale, now grey and stooped, answered softly, "No, we only followed where it led." By the time veterans gathered again in Hawaii in 1985, the explosions had long ceased, but their echoes remained. They remembered the thunder of bombs that owed their power to a formula once forbidden, the deep rumble of Composition B that could turn steel to vapor and ambition to ash. They remembered, too, that the secret of that formula was never just the ingredients, it was the will to mix them, to refine them, and to scale them, until chemistry became civilization's most terrible mirror. Thus, the story of the banned explosive ended not with a single detonation, but with a transformation of the world itself. From a rejected experiment in a New Jersey arsenal to the fireball over New Mexico, the path of RDX and Composition B traced the arc of the 20th century's most profound truth, that the line between discovery and destruction is drawn not by science, but by those who wield it. The chemist's secret had become humanity's inheritance, one measured in power, precision, and the lingering thunder of a blast heard around the world. In the years following 1945, the world's great powers inherited not merely victory, but a new relationship with energy itself. The same alchemy that had made Composition B possible became the cornerstone of the Cold War's armory, its science repurposed for both creation and annihilation. The chemists who had labored in secrecy at Picatinny, Eglin, and Holston now found themselves at the frontiers of a new age, an age that believed no force of nature could remain untamed once properly measured, weighed, and industrialized. The United States, recognizing the strategic edge granted by superior explosives and manufacturing, institutionalized its wartime chemistry. The Armed Forces Special Weapons Project, formed in 1947, absorbed much of the ordnance expertise developed during the war. Laboratories that had once tested bomb fillings now investigated everything from rocket propellants to nuclear triggers. The vocabulary changed. Energetic materials replaced explosives. Detonation velocity became reaction kinetics, but the goal remained the same: harness maximum energy under perfect control. Dr. George C. Hale, now retired from fieldwork, became a quiet advocate for responsible research. In a speech at Princeton in 1949, he warned, "Every compound of violence we make stable becomes a compound of temptation. We have learned not only how to destroy, but how to mass-produce destruction." His words carried little weight in the optimism of the era. America was building, expanding, inventing jet engines, guided missiles, and solid-fuel rockets, all owed their lineage to the once banned chemistry of RDX and its descendants. By the early 1950s, new compounds eclipsed the old formulas. HMX, known in laboratories as high melting explosive, was discovered to be even more powerful than RDX. Derived through precise temperature control of the same nitration process, it offered greater stability and higher detonation speed. Engineers blended it with plastic binders to create PBX, plastic bonded explosives, materials that could be molded into shapes without losing power. The banned formula had evolved into a new industrial language, one that would define modern warfare for the rest of the century. Ironically, the same safety techniques that had once prohibited Composition B now made it possible to manufacture even more lethal compounds with near-zero risk of accidental detonation. Continuous nitration reactors became automated, monitored by vacuum gauges and infrared sensors. The fear of spontaneous explosions that haunted the 1930s was replaced by computer-controlled precision. Factories that once filled bombs now filled rocket casings. The Holston plant itself remained active, producing both HMX and RDX for military stockpiles, and later for NASA's solid rocket boosters. Yet, amid triumphs of science, a quieter reckoning grew. Veterans of the ordnance divisions began writing memoirs, many for the first time acknowledging the psychological toll of their work. A chemist named Margaret L. Fowler, who had mixed TNT and RDX at Holston during the war, described the moment she realized the full scope of her contribution. "When the papers printed the word nuclear, I felt my hands shake. I remembered the same smell of nitric acid, the same hiss of pressure valves. I had not built the bomb, but I had built the road." The atomic shadow stretched long. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the balance between conventional and nuclear arms blurred. Every military laboratory seemed to chase the same paradox: how to create an explosive powerful enough to deter war, yet safe enough to store beside a runway. The Sandia Corporation, born from Los Alamos, perfected precisely machined explosive lenses using refined RDX composites. The implosion systems for hydrogen weapons were, in essence, advanced descendants of Composition B, made smoother, cleaner, and deadlier. Across the ocean, former adversaries followed similar paths. West Germany and Japan, their war industries dismantled, rebuilt research facilities under civilian pretenses. Japanese engineers studying post-war American patents noted with astonishment that the same compounds once deemed uncontrollable were now standards in mining, demolition, and aerospace. In a 1962 address at Kyoto University, Professor Saburo Iwaki, a former imperial chemist, remarked, "We learned in war that chemistry cannot be neutral. The molecules we called weapons now build our cities." His audience of students, many born after the war, applauded without irony. The transformation was cultural as much as technical. The explosive that had once symbolized destruction became the foundation of the post-war industrial boom. Plastic-bonded derivatives powered space exploration, blasting spacecraft from Cape Canaveral into the heavens. Mining companies adopted RDX, mixtures to carve highways through mountains. Even Hollywood borrowed the drama stock footage of test explosions at Eglin, and White Sands became shorthand for power, progress, and peril. But Hale never glorified it. In his final journal, discovered after his death in 1961, he wrote a line that historians would later carve into his memorial at Eglin Field. The chemist's duty is not to make fire, but to understand what fire makes of men. He had lived long enough to see his secret weapon become a household element of the modern world, its derivatives in quarrying, construction, and even medicine, where shockwave therapy borrowed its principles from detonation physics. The forbidden flame had escaped the arsenal and entered civilization's bloodstream. At the Pacific Theater Veterans Reunion in Hawaii in 1985, former aviators and ordnance officers gathered to share their memories. Among them was an aged Japanese pilot named Saburo Sakai, who once faced P-47 seconds over New Guinea. When asked what he remembered most about American bombs, he replied simply, "They did not miss." Then, after a pause, he added, "They were not bombs anymore. They were factories of air turned against us." Hale's surviving colleagues nodded silently. They understood the metaphor too well. By the century's end, Composition B remained in service, a relic and a reminder. Its descendants powered missiles, mining charges, and spacecraft. Its creation had rewritten the rules of war and peace alike. What began as a banned formula, a dangerous curiosity buried in an ordnance memo, had become the molecular signature of modernity. The line between science and sin had grown thinner with each innovation, yet the lesson of its birth remained. The legacy of the forbidden flame was not merely technological, it was moral. It proved that progress, once harnessed, cannot be undone, that every discovery carries both its shadow and its light. The chemists at Picatinny had sought stability and found power. Their successors sought power and found responsibility. In the final reckoning, Composition B's story was the story of the 20th century itself, a century that learned to calculate destruction, to manufacture the unimaginable, and to live forever in the echo of its own brilliance. The flame that once burned only in laboratories now glowed across the world, in rockets, in industries, and in memory, forever reminding mankind that every act of creation is also an act of awakening.